Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, along here with London Paul. And Paul, there's an interesting thing that has been happening in lieu of the saber rattling from the United States. And I am referencing, of course, where their accusations against Iran and China regarding supplying arms to Russia has now become such a bugaboo that they are declaring sanctions across the board on sanctions they've already done. But with that being said, it appears that the foreign ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, is putting an end to that very quickly. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of the discussion. And wow, some fascinating things coming out as we head towards the BRICS summit.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks again, Ken, for joining me. It's always a pleasure. We do things together. Well, yeah, I think this is an important statement. For me, I've said for a number of years that China and Russia have a military alliance. They'll never say it. They'll never admit it. They'll couch things in a way that doesn't sound like it is. But for me, it's always been the case now. I don't think the West believes this to be true either. They certainly know there's military cooperation between the two countries. No doubt they share intelligence, satellite positioning. To what extent China's assisted Russia in the war is not from a military perspective. They haven't given them arms. Yeah, they've supported them in terms of buying energy and all the other things that they supported the Russian economy in non-dollar terms, of course. And I never know how to pronounce, because I always, like you, have spent years saying Maria Zakharova. Apparently it's not, it's something like Zarova or something. Anyway, so she came out with a statement, for me, that's a bombshell statement. And I don't use that word very lightly. But yesterday came out and made the statement that, yes, well, Russia, but its partnership with China is not aimed against third countries. Well, yeah, that's extremely important. So that, because that's precisely what the United States is. Everything is aimed against third-party countries. But came out and caveated that with the statement, but the two powers could combine potential. That's a great statement. Maybe the translation didn't work particularly well. But if faced with a threat, note from the United States. So the statement was qualified with, I would like to remind you that Moscow and Beijing will respond to double containment by the United States with double counteraction. When asked about the possible deployment, we spoke before about US missiles in Japan, because there was a report about a few days ago that the United States had expressed its interest in deploying Typhoon mid-range missile systems to Japan. Note for joint military exercises. Really, what are they going to do? Test these missiles on each other? I mean, it's clearly obvious. The US is trying to provoke, we've said this before, China into a response with respect to Taiwan. So the statement continued saying it's clear that both Russia and China will react to the emergence of additional and significant missile threats, which of course they're not, because what's Japan going to do? Launch missiles at China and nuclear power? Absolutely not. But, let's play the game. Let's, have some reverse psychology, some psyop with the West. Let's get the United States thinking what's really going on. And they further continued saying the reaction will be far from political, which also repeatedly being confirmed by the two countries. So Russia and China has a strategic partnership, in inverted commas. It's not aggressive in its intent. They don't want to challenge third-party nations, meaning, we're not here to gang up on other countries like the United States has done. But double counteraction doesn't contradict this. It's a defensive position. I mean, wow, what a statement, because that's the US's stock answer. We're defending ourselves against US aggression. Well, in this case, putting missiles in Japan, whether to what extent those missiles are put there and for what purposes in reality don't matter. It's an aggressive posture. So why can't China and Russia say this is a defensive position? We're not targeting other countries. But obviously, if an aggressive policy of attack was being implemented against us from one center, note, why don't we combine our potential and give it an appropriate rebuff? Now, let's chew that very carefully and assess what it means, because let's look at this. If you look at why the United States, just hypothetically speaking, but as far as most people are concerned, would put missiles in Japan, it's to counter China. It's to make Japan go, you need to protect yourself because China's an aggressor. Look, China might take Taiwan. You could be next. You know, that usual psychological nonsense. In no way, shape, or form is Japan going to go, I know, let's fire some missiles at Russia. So why make the statement, well, you know, if a policy of attack is being implemented against us from one center, meaning the United States effectively, or Japan, that therefore is a military alliance, because the statement then is, if you attack one of us, you attack both of us. We are taking defensive position because, of course, Russia and China are never going to launch missile strikes on Japan. Clearly, this is idiotic to think otherwise. But that's what they're saying. Effectively, that is an admission. It's kind of like an Article 5. But what do we mean by that? What is Article 5 in reality for Russia and China? And the West now should be looking at this and will be going, so do they have a military alliance? Does that therefore mean that if China's attacked directly or indirectly, does that mean Russia will come to their response? Bearing in mind, the United States and Sikorsky's made the point, we never want to go to war with Russia. No, we don't want direct confrontation. This is very cleverly repositioning, not just and reaffirming Russia's position with regards to threats that would be posed in this case really by the United States, but also saying, well, if you decide to attack China in some capacity, whether it's directly or indirectly, then you will have to contend with us also. This is as bigger admission of a military alliance as you're ever going to hear. I don't think it could be any clearer without actually making that statement. And obviously, be interested to know your perspective, Ken.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, while this has been speculated and there's been a lot of different, I mean, obviously we know when Xi and Putin got together, their partnership had to extend beyond just economic and as part of the multipolar world. But I'm wondering, you know, as this is going to be moved and discussed at the BRICS summit, upcoming BRICS summit, you have to wonder if it's also going to be something that the statement of not using it to attack smaller countries, but just simply as a deterrent against the bigger nations, the Europe, the United States, any of those, so that any of the countries that end up joining the SCO, the BRICS, maybe whatever comes out of the Middle East or West Asia, they're not going to you're not going to see the Russian-Chinese interventions in smaller little conflicts between two countries, etc. But if they get attacked or there's aggression against them from the bigger countries, then those who are part of the coalition may be able to call upon Russia and China saying, we're the umbrella protectorate of those within the BRICS, of those within the ASEAN, of those within the SCO, and hands off, they're under our protection. That's something I'm looking for as a future thing, but starting out with Russia and China, laying out the groundwork and the foundation, we are just here for protection against the big opposition. It's going to send a message to those who are trying to shed the yoke of colonialism.
Yeah, and you raise a great number of points there, because you can, I mean, we're extrapolating again, we're in the realms of thinking some, I would say, plausible, possible extensions of this, because you're absolutely right. It could be that, and we'll come on to this BRICS Security Summit shortly, But I wanted to just put some other points on this to put some context. Remember, 3 weeks before the Ukraine war started, Putin and Xi signed what was termed a no limits partnership deal. That was 2.5 years ago. Only a matter of 4 months ago, they signed an agreement to deepen what they said was this comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation. So, whilst they've never declared this formal military alliance, what did Putin say only a few days ago? We are allies in every sense of the word. So I think every sense of the word would include military option. They've certainly staged multiple, in recent years, military exercises together. They've had naval drills that started recently. And, effectively, they've been sending very polite warnings to the United States and saying, don't consider trying to create an Asian NATO effectively in the Asia Pacific region. And just a small point on that, it's interesting, the Canadians have come out a couple of days ago and gone, the idea of an Asian NATO is not happening. There are no ways that ever happening. So, okay, it's only Canada, no disrespect to Canada, but they're a NATO member and they generally don't make statements that oppose the United States unless they're very much vehemently opposed to them. But what this sends, and you're absolutely right, Ken, is a broader concern for the West is, well, if they are a military alliance, and if they do then extend what this military alliance might mean, because the SCO is not a military alliance, they have military objectives, for sure, amongst the groups, and they collaborate with each other, they cooperate with each other, they share intelligence, whatever. That's absolutely correct. But let's look at some of the potential flashpoints aside from Asia. There's always Central Asia. We've talked about that before. Well, does that send a signal? Well, if you start meddling in those regions, that is effectively, maybe will be protectorate to them. Maybe we will say that is a threat to our national security, which it absolutely could be. And therefore, we're going to act on that. So this is trying to give the United States some food for thought. Now, what's worth noting at the moment, there are BRICS representatives at a security meeting, which is just finishing today in St. Petersburg. And it's quite telling that the Iranians' Supreme National Security Council Secretary Madian came out and proposed, note, a security structure within the BRICS groups of nations. So this would be to counter terrorism, extremism, drug trafficking, interesting illegal biological activities, human trafficking, and the abuse of emerging technologies, and to create joint mechanisms to ensure maritime security and tackle cyber threats. That's a very broad remit. Now, let's imagine if that's implemented. That then sends a very, very serious statement to the West as well, because terrorism can be defined in many contexts alone. I mean, Russia has referred to the Ukraine, obviously incursion into Kursk, as terrorism. So, that is a very broad stick to justify a response to a whole range of activities that the West may or may not be involved in certain BRICS countries in the future, or BRICS plus countries. So I think that's immediately something to consider. And okay, what's the purpose of BRICS security? Could this evolve the BRICS nations into, I'm not saying a NATO alliance per se, but imagine a year or two, 5 years down the line, maybe that's precisely what will happen. And the question is, why did they meet anyway? I mean, if you're not talking about security in a serious way, there's no point having these meetings.
No, I very much agree. And, I think the opening statement you made regarding this is that Russia and China had not publicly solidified that this agreement between each other was formalized. And for all intents and purposes, when Maria Zakharova comes out and says something, it's gospel, as opposed to what we see from the U.S. with Blinken, Sullivan, or any of the others, Stoltenberg, and with NATO. They bloviate and do saber rattling, as mentioned in the last podcast, to unnerve Russia. But when the spokesperson for the foreign ministry comes out and says something, it's gospel. It's already done. It's, not something absolutely new. It's been going on, but now we're officially letting it know. And I think that's going to be vastly important, because as probably the next U.S. president comes into office, they're going to have to accept that reality. And when they start making policies, they're going to have to recognize that whatever we do with Russia, it has to, China is going to be involved, and vice versa.
Yeah, and the point is that Shoigu, who's now the Russian Security Council Secretary, it's quite amusing how many people claim that he's been demoted. He hasn't been demoted. He's moved into another position inside the Russian government. And he talked about this whole BRICS security summit and saying, it's going to discuss bilateral relations, multilateral relations, and they discussed countries' proposals with regards to Ukraine. So we already know China's proposed a way to end the war, and Brazil has. Now, from my perspective, in the end, if there's going to be an agreement reached, it'll be with the US and Russia, and Ukraine will be forced to abide by that agreement, and that's the only way. Now, that doesn't mean that other nations can't make statements, but to what extent those statements or proposals will ever be implemented, I don't think they will. But what this is a case of is, look, we as BRICS nations have this relationship where we all discuss things like adults, so there's nobody going to be excluded. No one's opinions will in any way, shape, or form be excluded. Everyone's entitled to voice their opinions about things and raise issues and things that will affect all of us, maybe collectively or individually, or bilaterally or whatever. And that's the big difference. In future, these organizations are not dictates by the United States, as we've seen with NATO, etc.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing when you take a look at the policies being implemented, not just implemented from on high, but you have to, people have to understand that these are usually the culmination of discussions that have gone on for years between ministers on both sides. And to facilitate something like this, especially amongst major powers, where one doesn't dominate the other, i.e. US over Europe and US over NATO, is that these things have to come from a collaboration of trust. And when those who join eventually the BRICS, the ASEAN, the SCO, Eurasian Economic Union, or whoever, they're going to recognize going in that Russia and China, who are the backbone of all of these organizations, they have a mutual trust that's based on actual tangible actions and things that they've done together, rather than some fragile framework based on fear of some bogeyman out there.
Yeah, and here's the difference. Let's extrapolate this. And it's not that China and Russia dominate everything. They're the two major architects of multipolarity, shall we say. But the Asian countries in Southeast Asia, and we've talked about them before, is a huge, enormously important kind of alliance of countries. They work with the Chinese, they work with the Russians, and they will do so increasingly in the future. There is huge economic benefit in doing so, financial benefit. And of course, they want to protect their interests in these regions and these relationships against the threat of terrorism, extremism, and all the other potential threats that could harm their economic and financial futures. And of course, what it could do societally if there were terrorist attacks, for example, in those countries. So they've got a joint reason, based on their win-win cooperation, to have a security arrangement between the ASEAN countries and China, the ASEAN countries and Russia, as one example. So do they have to join the SCO, these countries? No. Some of them are, but do they all have to join? No, they don't. That's the point. But maybe they do join the SCO. Maybe the SCO then will have an alliance of countries who all come together and work as they do already in mutual cooperation to defend themselves from terrorist threats, etc., and all the other things the Iranians were suggesting in BRICS. So maybe there's a crossover. Maybe the BRICS countries, and maybe eventually there'll be 50 countries in BRICS who will all adopt this. Is it going to be like NATO? No, it isn't. Will they have to have it? No, because in the future, NATO will not exist. The United States will not be this dominating power. But they will have to protect their interests. Therefore, they form these organizations to do so. And collectively, that will shift the whole mindset of the world from a security perspective and redefine what matters in terms of protecting individual nations, as opposed, as you rightly say, Ken, to having a bogeyman who apparently wants to invade your countries and destroy it. It's not going to be about arms being sold to all these countries to hugely benefit one country. There is always going to be risks. There are always going to be threats. Even if eventually the West and the United States particularly decide to normalize relations, particularly with the Russians, there are still going to be problems. And therefore, there is going to always need to be things in place to deal with emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and it being abused, like cybercrime, etc., etc. And it is possible, and I wasn't joking, that some kid can be in his parents' basement and hold the world to ransom. That has to be, sounds ridiculous, but it's feasible. So the world has to address the challenges in future, and these organizations can work together. You could have the Central Asian countries working with the Russians and the Chinese. You could have the Eurasian Economic Union, includes Russia, of course, maybe, and it does include some STAM republics. Maybe they're going to work and liaise more with other countries in the region who might be in the SCO, of course, like Pakistan and India, for example, just to illustrate a broader point. There are many pieces to this puzzle. They're not necessarily all going to end up in the same puzzle, but it's all part of a need for the global South to look after their own interests, to protect their interests, primarily economic and financial, but also that by extension is to protect their societies, their countries, their nation against perceived threats in the future. Not about nuclear war, not about waging wars with other countries. They're not the issue anymore. But there will always be potential threats, and it becomes less of an issue of a threat from individual countries. But, there is going to be the risk in the future that sporadic terrorism, and biological activities could potentially be a huge problem, for argument's sake. And it doesn't necessarily mean that relates to a specific country. So you have to meet the challenges of the future. And this is why, the statement from China and Russia is very important in the short term to address the current unipolar security model, i.e. NATO, etc. But in a broader sense, the BRICS security, the SCO, the ASEAN countries, the Eurasian Economic Union. Then there's Africa and how they're working with the Russians and the Chinese on security as well, because Africa has to protect its interests. So it's a global South perspective on a new security model. And the West has got no say in any of this. It will just have to sit there and allow these countries to have the autonomy and to make the decisions they want. And at times they will disagree with each other. And there'll be probably public disagreement between allies, but that's the way the world should be. In the end, you have to reach a consensus based on mutual respect, trust, and cooperation. And that's going to be the future. And without that, then you're just going to be as bad as what's happened since World War II, where there's no trust, no cooperation, and it's just a centrally controlled hegemony that says when I say how high, you jump that high.
Yeah, and for everybody here listening, it reminds me of Lord Acton, historian Lord Acton. He was in Paris on the night of the attack on the Bastille and the start of the French Revolution. And I'm putting that parallel because we are all getting to see the transition away from the old hegemonic world post World War II, post Cold War, and the rise of multipolarity, the end of unipolarity, the end of an empire, the rise of mutual, more sovereign nationalism. And it's just something fascinating to see because we're having history, something that doesn't occur once every 100, 500 years take place right before our eyes. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And of course, likewise.
And to everybody here as part of the Sirius Report community, thank you for being a part of it as well. And don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share to anybody you think this is important for. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.